The price spiked. Not gradually, not over weeks. In 48 hours, lithium carbonate jumped 37%. But here's what the commodity headlines missed. This wasn't a supply shock. This wasn't a demand surge. This was weaponization. And the war for electric vehicle supremacy just turned into actual war. The surface story sounds simple enough. Lithium prices moved higher. Commodity markets responding to supply and demand fundamentals. Standard market behavior. They're not telling you the real story. Because what happened in those 48 hours wasn't market forces. It was strategic positioning. It was resource nationalism. It was someone demonstrating control over the entire foundation of the green energy transition. And that someone, they just sent a message that should terrify anyone who owns an electric vehicle. Anyone invested in battery technology. Anyone betting their portfolio on the clean energy future. Let me show you what actually happened. 48 hours ago, 3 separate lithium supply agreements were terminated. Not renegotiated, not delayed, terminated. Contracts worth $8.4 billion. Deals that were supposed to supply Western battery manufacturers through 2030. Gone, with 72 hours notice. The companies involved, SQM from Chile, Ganfeng from China, Livent from Argentina. They didn't announce these terminations. They didn't file the required disclosures. They didn't explain to their shareholders why they just walked away from multi-billion-dollar revenue streams. But the lithium price told you everything. 37% spike in 2 days. That's not how commodity markets work. That's not how supply chains adjust to disruption. That's how prices move, when someone with inside information starts positioning ahead of scarcity they know is coming. This is where things stop making sense. Because lithium isn't oil. You can't just pump more out of the ground when demand increases. Lithium extraction requires specific geological conditions, specific processing capabilities, specific infrastructure that takes years to develop. Chile controls 26% of global lithium reserves. Australia has 21%. China has only 7% of the reserves. But here's what matters. China controls 78% of lithium processing capacity. 78%. So when contracts start getting terminated, when supply agreements get canceled, when processing facilities suddenly develop technical difficulties, China doesn't need to own the mines. They control the bottleneck. And that bottleneck just tightened. But here's what makes this particularly dangerous. The electric vehicle industry built their entire business model on the assumption that lithium would remain abundant and cheap. Tesla's gigafactories, GM's Ultium platform, Volkswagen's battery partnerships, all of it designed around unlimited access to processed lithium at predictable prices. What happens when that assumption breaks? The math becomes devastating. A typical electric vehicle battery requires 63 kilograms of lithium carbonate. At last week's prices, that represented roughly $400 in raw material costs per vehicle. At today's prices, after the 37% spike, that same battery now costs $550, $150 increase per vehicle. Multiply that across 16 million electric vehicles produced annually. That's $2.4 billion in additional costs that someone has to absorb. But that's just the beginning. Because the price spike isn't reflecting actual scarcity yet. It's reflecting fear of future scarcity. It's reflecting the market's understanding that lithium supply chains just became a geopolitical weapon. And weapons get used. Let me give you the numbers that should worry you. Global lithium demand is projected to reach 1.5 million tons by 2030. That's a 400% increase from current production. To meet that demand, the industry needs to build processing capacity equivalent to 40 new facilities. Facilities that cost $3 billion each. Facilities that take 7 to 10 years to construct. But here's the critical detail. 73% of those planned facilities, they're being built in China, not in countries that control lithium reserves. In China, which means that even if South American and Australian mines increase production, the processed material still flows through Chinese infrastructure. China just demonstrated they can turn that flow off. This doesn't happen by accident. This level of market control requires years of strategic planning, requires coordination between government policy and industrial capacity, requires understanding that resource control equals geopolitical leverage. The terminated contracts suggest that understanding is now being operationalized. But here's where individual companies become systemically vulnerable. Tesla stock dropped 12% when the lithium price spiked. 12% in one day. Because investors suddenly realized that Tesla's vertically integrated supply chain, their celebrated independence from traditional automakers, that independence disappears when the raw materials get weaponized. Elon Musk talked about building lithium refineries in Texas. But talking about capacity and building capacity are different things. And building capacity takes time that companies burning through $40 billion in annual production costs don't have. GM announced they're exploring lithium extraction from the Salton Sea. Exploration, not production, not processing. Exploration. Meanwhile, Chinese battery manufacturers, KTL, BYD, Gotion, They're not exploring, they're not announcing, they're operating. With secure access to processed lithium through supply chains they control. When resource wars begin, the companies with secure supply chains survive. The companies dependent on global markets, they become casualties. And the casualties, they're about to multiply. Because lithium is just one critical material. Electric vehicle batteries also require cobalt, nickel, manganese, graphite. China controls significant portions of processing capacity for all of these materials. If lithium supply can be weaponized, if contracts can be terminated without warning, what happens when the same strategy gets applied to cobalt, to nickel, to the rare earth elements required for electric motors? The entire electric vehicle industry could be shut down overnight. Not through military action, not through sanctions or trade wars, through supply chain control that's already in place. The terminated contracts suggest that control is about to be exercised. But there's a deeper systemic risk that most people don't understand. The green energy transition, the shift from fossil fuels to battery technology, it was supposed to reduce dependence on hostile nations. Supposed to eliminate the geopolitical leverage that oil-producing countries held over consumer nations. Instead, it's creating new dependencies, more concentrated dependencies. Dependencies on countries that have demonstrated willingness to use resource control as a weapon. When Saudi Arabia cuts oil production, gasoline prices rise. But you can still drive your car. You can still heat your home. The economy slows, but it doesn't stop. When China cuts lithium processing, when cobalt supply gets restricted, when rare earth exports face temporary delays, electric vehicles stop being manufactured. Renewable energy projects halt construction. The entire clean technology sector becomes paralyzed. That's not energy independence. That's energy vulnerability disguised as progress. And the vulnerability, it's about to be tested. Because the terminated contracts weren't random. They weren't market-driven business decisions. They were coordinated actions designed to demonstrate control, to show Western governments and companies what happens when resource nationalism becomes resource warfare. The message is clear. You want electric vehicles? You need our lithium. You want solar panels? You need our polysilicon. You want wind turbines? You need our rare earths. And access becomes conditional on compliance. Compliance with what? That's the question nobody wants to ask. Because the answer determines whether the green energy transition continues or becomes a strategic disaster that leaves Western economies dependent on hostile supply chains. The lithium price spike suggests those conditions are about to be revealed. But here's what makes this particularly dangerous for investors. The market is still pricing electric vehicle companies as if lithium remains abundant and cheap, as if supply chains remain stable and predictable, as if geopolitical risk doesn't apply to clean energy technologies. Tesla trades at 60 times earnings. GM's Ultium platform is valued at $40 billion. Volkswagen's electrification strategy assumes they'll produce 4 million electric vehicles annually by 2025. All of those valuations, all of those production targets, and all of those business models, they collapse if lithium supply becomes unreliable or unaffordable. The 37% price spike is just the beginning. It's the market testing Western resolve, testing whether companies and governments understand the leverage they've handed to countries that control processing capacity. And the early signals suggest they don't understand. They're still thinking in terms of market forces and business negotiations. They're not thinking in terms of resource warfare and strategic vulnerability. That disconnect between perception and reality, that's where fortunes get destroyed. Because resource wars don't follow business school models. They follow historical precedents. And history shows that countries controlling critical resources use that control to advance geopolitical objectives that have nothing to do with profit maximization. The terminated contracts suggest those geopolitical objectives are now active. Which brings us to timing. Because resource warfare isn't sustainable indefinitely, it creates incentives for substitution, for alternative supply chains, for technological workarounds. But it takes time to develop those alternatives. Time during which the controlling powers can extract maximum leverage from their position. The lithium price spike suggests that extraction phase has begun. How long does it last? How far do prices rise before demand destruction sets in? How many electric vehicle companies fail before alternative supply chains come online? Those are the questions that determine whether this transition represents opportunity or catastrophe for the global economy. The terminated contracts suggest the controlling powers are betting on catastrophe. Betting that Western dependence on Chinese processing capacity is so deep, so embedded in industrial infrastructure, that alternatives can't be developed fast enough to matter. And if they're right, if lithium prices continue rising, if supply restrictions expand to other critical materials, the entire clean energy sector doesn't just underperform, it becomes uninvestable. Companies with secure supply chains survive. Companies dependent on global markets become acquisition targets or bankruptcy cases. The institutional money is already moving. quietly rotating out of pure-play electric vehicle manufacturers and into vertically integrated resource companies. Companies that control mining, processing, and production within single corporate structures. The retail investors still buying Tesla stock and clean energy ETFs. They're betting against institutional positioning that sees resource warfare accelerating. Historically, that's not a winning bet, because money flows follow information flows. And the information flowing through institutional networks suggests the lithium wars aren't a future threat. They're a present reality. The 37% price spike in 48 hours, that wasn't the opening shot. That was the demonstration of firepower. The real war, the sustained campaign to extract maximum leverage from resource control, that's just beginning. And in resource wars, the side that controls supply chains doesn't just win. They rewrite the rules of entire industries. The rules are being rewritten right now. The question is whether you recognize that the old assumptions, abundant lithium, stable supply chains, predictable commodity prices, those assumptions just became obsolete. The market will eventually price in that obsolescence. But by the time the price adjustment is complete, the positioning opportunities will have disappeared. The terminated contracts were the warning. The 37% price spike was the confirmation. What comes next? That's the reallocation. From companies dependent on weaponized supply chains to companies that control their own resources. From technologies requiring critical materials to technologies that don't. From business models built on globalization assumptions to models designed for resource nationalism reality. The reallocation is happening now, not tomorrow, not next quarter, right now. While most people are still trying to figure out why lithium prices move so dramatically in just 48 hours, by the time they understand, the resource wars will be over, and the winners will have already been determined.